Bloomberg Audio Studios. Podcasts, radio, news. This is Bloomberg Businessweek Daily, reporting from the magazine that helps global leaders stay ahead, with insight on the people, companies, and trends shaping today's complex economy, plus global business, finance, and tech news as it happens. The Bloomberg Businessweek Daily podcast with Carol Masser and Tim Stenivek on Bloomberg Radio.
David Gura here with Emily Griffeo on Bloomberg Businessweek on Bloomberg Radio and YouTube from the Interactive Broker Studio in New York City, where there's some news about a university just up the street from us. That is Columbia University, no longer meeting the accreditation standards set by the Department of Education. Some breaking news here in the last few minutes. Of course, this is one of a handful of schools that have been in the crosshairs of the Trump administration. The Secretary of Education, Linda McMahon, saying in a statement the school's leadership, quote, acted with deliberate indifference toward the harassment of Jewish students on its campus after the October 7th attack by Hamas on Israel. I'm reading there from a piece by Kayla Gardner, who covers the White House for us here at Bloomberg News and joins us now from Washington. Kayla, let's just start with the basic facts of this here. We've seen the government go after Columbia's finances, threaten to withhold funding for research and the like. This seems to be ratcheting up its fight even more. What does it mean, in effect, that the government taking away this accreditation for Columbia?
So we should clarify that the Education Department is notifying the entity that has given Columbia University its accreditation, which basically gives them the power to issue degrees. Basically is the definition for why they are a university. They're notifying here Middle States Commission on Higher Education that they believe that the university is in violation of anti-discrimination laws. That is, of course, tied to anti-Semitism that they say is happening on campus and the protests that we've seen on the war in Gaza here. And this is really a turn in narrative when it comes to the relationship between the administration and Columbia, because there had been signals from President Trump, from Secretary McMahon, that conversations were in the right direction between her and the university's president. And of course, Harvard took a big step with lawsuits against the administration. Now, Columbia has not been doing that. So this certainly suggests that conversations perhaps are not going in the direction that certainly Columbia hopes that they are.
Kayla, you write from a quote here from Linda McMahon that accreditors have an enormous public responsibility as gatekeepers of federal student aid. They determine which institutions are eligible for federal student loans and Pell Grants. So just talk about they're notifying Columbia, but actually, like in practice, is anything changing for the university or its students yet?
So the responsibility is really on the accreditor here to take these findings and assess them and assess Columbia's accreditation going forward here. But this is really a concept or a theme, if you will, that the president has been talking about on the campaign trail. He has long believed that the accreditation system is unfair, and he has talked about alternatives from traditional universities. And a huge part of that is they believe that there is bias on a lot of these private campuses, a lot of these Ivy League campuses, that they believe is not a welcoming place for conservatives, and certainly the ideals that are driving his movement.
I want to go back to something that you mentioned just a moment ago, and that is the kind of status of dialogue or the relationship between Columbia and the Trump administration. So we saw it really deteriorate under the leadership of Anu Shafiq, who was the president of the school for a very short period of time. She was succeeded by Katrina Armstrong, who was president for an even shorter period of time. On an interim basis, she was heading the medical school and moved over to the presidency, stepped down. And now Claire Shipman, who had been heading Columbia's board of trustees, is the interim president, the new interim president. Get us up to speed on sort of how much the two entities are talking, the administration and Columbia, and sort of what the university has done in recent weeks to kind of comport or talk with the administration about a path forward here.
Well, Secretary McMahon has been very public that she has had conversations with the president. She has spoke somewhat admiringly of the current president, but she says these negotiations are ongoing, both with Columbia and Harvard. And we saw Columbia put out a statement where they said that they were not open to some of these demands that the administration has when it comes to, quote, viewpoint discrimination, where they really asked Columbia and Harvard to make these sort of changes to their faculty and their students to sort of represent more viewpoints when it comes to political or ideological beliefs, because, again, they believe that these institutions have a bias, particularly a liberal bias, on campus.
This is obviously a breaking news situation, and you write that Columbia did not yet respond to requests for comments, but how do you think the university is going to respond?
Well, I can't tell you exactly what they will respond until they actually do, but Columbia has been very measured as opposed to Harvard, who has taken now 2 lawsuits against the administration, one on student visas and one to get their federal funding back. So they have been measured up until this point, really trying to strike a deal with the administration through negotiation. So I'm certainly interested to see if they go the route that we've seen Harvard go, or they continue to try to have these negotiations behind closed doors to potentially get their funding back. And of course here also to defend their accreditation as a university.
Kayla, great to talk to you. As always, Kayla Gardner covers the White House for us here at Bloomberg News with that breaking news story here that the Trump administration is targeting Columbia's accreditation over protests. And Kayla, bringing up that nuance, which is so important here, the Education Department notifying the Middle States Commission, that is the accreditor, that they do not think that Columbia meets the qualifications for accreditation. And that can have all kinds of ramifications, I'm sure, for the university itself, but certainly students who are attending the school or intending to go there. And just picking up on one more thing that she mentioned, that is the role of Harvard University and all of that. Alan Garber, the president of Harvard, has been adamant that the way in which the administration has dealt with that school is a warning sign, as he put it, for what might happen with other schools. So picking up on your question, your very good question, Emily, sort of how they might respond. I'm curious if they kind of follow in the mold of what Harvard's done recently, which is to really stand up against the administration.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Businessweek Daily podcast. Catch us live weekday afternoons from 2 to 5 p.m. Eastern. Listen on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app, or watch us live on YouTube.
Well, let's get back to the big, beautiful bill. On Capitol Hill, Republicans in the Senate are working on their version of what President Trump calls this big, beautiful bill. And as they do that, we're getting new details from the nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office about what the House version as passed would do to the federal deficit. The CBO estimates it would add $2.4 trillion to U.S. budget deficits over the next decade. The CBO also says it expects it would leave almost 11 million people in the United States without health insurance in 2024. Henrietta Treyz is the co-founder of Veda Partners, where she is director of economic policy with a particular expertise in how the Senate works. So she joins us now. Talk about these numbers. What exactly do they tell us, Henrietta?
These are big numbers. 2.4 trillion is a record breaker. The last highest reconciliation bill was 1.9 trillion. So this will be winning some awards for sheer deficit increases on that account, which is exciting. The bill is going to change a lot from here. And my base case expectation, knowing the Senate, is that it's going to become more deficit financed. I think for bond investors, there's something to watch for here, in that the senators are going to use a current policy baseline where the House does not. And this is a big differential between the two chambers. The House assumes that passing an extension of the 2017 tax cuts, plus some of the other components of the bill, will generate $2.5 trillion of economic activity, dynamic growth. On the Senate side, they're not going to use that formula to wipe away some of the budget costs. They're going to instead assume that extending the existing rates costs nothing. $3.8 trillion or $1.3 trillion more will be deficit financed. So the scale of the Senate bill is going to be quite a bit more substantial. They're going to try to make some of the business provisions more permanent than the House bill. The SALT cap is going to have to come down. The IRA cuts are going to have to come down. The Medicaid cuts are going to have to come down. The deficit is going to grow, is the bottom line, as the Senate spends the next 4 weeks crafting their version of this bill.
Henrietta, I'm curious, as I'm sure you are, about how a Senator Rand Paul is looking at the numbers from CBO today, maybe a Rick Scott, maybe a Ron Johnson as well, as they kind of make the argument for deeper cuts in the Senate version of this bill. I heard Senator Paul talking about the power that he thinks he and these other holdouts have here in these negotiations. And I'm curious if you think that he's right about that these holdouts are going to be able to exert some real sway here as the Senate gets down to brass tacks and reshapes this bill.
Great question. I actually think this is some of the most interesting change that we've seen since the Senate has taken up this bill and gotten back from recess. Rand Paul's material objection is to the $5 trillion increase to the debt ceiling that the Senate bill is going to include. And so there's already discussion of trying to get him back into the fold as a potential yes vote in changing the debt ceiling numbers associated with the Senate package. So right now, the sort of whisper around the senators in the Republican conference is that, hey, maybe we just cut that in half and get Rand Paul over to our side again. Because right now, if Rand Paul is a no just on the debt ceiling alone, then Senator Thune only has 2 votes to lose from there. So cutting the debt ceiling hike, which is not the same as the deficit, but a really important part for Rand Paul, down to $2.5 trillion, which would get the Senate and Congress functionality through about March of 2026 instead of November of 2026, is, I'm told, a part of the conversation. So we're really trying to move the parameters of what might get Rand Paul, which to me really underscores the trouble that Leader Thune is going to face when we get back to what you were just mentioning. The 10.9 million individuals will be kicked off Medicaid, 9.5 million of whom are not in the undocumented migrant space that Republicans talk about a lot. These are just regular, everyday Americans who will be kicked off of the Medicaid program. So there's going to be a lot of loss from West Virginia, Susan Collins in Maine, the Alaska senators, that's Sullivan, who's up for re-election next year, and Murkowski. So there's a lot of moving parts that Thune needs to walk through here. Getting Rand Paul on board by cutting the debt ceiling hike in half might be very helpful.
So how then do you anticipate the timeline of this bill eventually making its way to President Trump, maybe assuming that we do get those holdouts, the Rand Pauls, signing off on it? Is the timeline really realistic that this does get on Trump's desk by July 4th?
No, it's going to go through the Senate by July 4th. That's the strategy that Senator Thune is working with right now. There are 3 committees who are rolling out their bill this week. There will be another next week. And then the Senate Finance Committee, which is responsible for almost all the package, all the tax provisions and the Medicaid cuts, they're going to go last. And that'll come either the week of the 16th, right before Juneteenth, or it'll come the following week, the week of June 23rd. This bill is going to get very messy, very complicated. They have a lot of changes that they need to make with the House Republican package. And as I mentioned, the SALT caucus alone is going to raise holy hell with them. And they're going to be in a meeting at some point. They haven't been given an audience yet, but they will have to do that. And then what that creates is a scenario where the House and the Senate actually go to conference. First and foremost, for investors, what you should hear when I say that is this is a time suck. It can be 1, 2, 3 weeks even. So that paints the picture for passages of this legislation at the end of July. July 24th is when the House is scheduled to go on recess. August 1st is when the Senate is scheduled to go on recess. The X date for the debt ceiling is in mid-August. That's the time horizon folks should work with.
Very quickly here, just what is happening at this moment, drawing on your experience working in the Senate, what's happening at this moment in time? I know committees are releasing their legislation sort of one by one, but in the minute that we have left, sort of what's the actual state of play? What's happening on the ground in Senate office buildings today?
Lobbyists are fanned out everywhere. They're trying to get their IRA tax credit back in. They're trying to tweak the I-899 provision that gives the Treasury Secretary the authority to tax unfair tax countries, foreign entities and such. There's a lot of behind the scenes work going on before that bill gets released. The rule of thumb in DC is you want to get your provision out before the bill gets released. Get it out before it's in. Once it's in, you can't get it out. So the aggressive lobbying happening behind the scenes right now.
Henrietta, always good to talk to you, get your update. That's Henrietta Trey. She's the co-founder of Veda Partners, where she's the director of economic policy.
I'm driving in my car.
How about you let me drive?
Oh, no. This is not a toy.
Who's gonna drive you home?
Honey, please, I'll do the driving.
Drive on.
Excuse me, I want to drive.
It's the question that drives us.
This is the Drive to the Close.
That funky music will drive us till the dawn.
On Bloomberg Radio.
All right, time now for the Drive to the Close. Today we're joined with Brent Schutte, Chief Investment Officer of Northwestern Mutual Wealth Management. They have over $300 billion in assets under management. Brent joins us on Zoom from Milwaukee. I want to get your reaction to the economic data that we got today. The subsequent reaction in the Treasury market, yields are down. Traders betting that maybe we'll get up to 3 rate cuts this year. What's your reaction to the data and those Fed bets right now?
Sure. So I think the question that most have been asking is, does the soft data, so the survey data that has been weak, does it start leaking into the hard data? And that's where I think most people believed that potentially there was hope that it would not. But I think this morning with ADP, you're starting to see that potentially it's leaking into the hard data, which is labor markets and job hiring. And you saw those come down quite a bit. You have the ISM services, which is still soft data, but a good data source historically. That's where the services index, which has held up the economy while manufacturing has been weak the past few years. it faltered. And then last but not least, you had the Beige Book, where it showed weakness, and it had a comment about consumer spending declining slightly in most districts, or even faltering, or even being neutral. And so that's where I think you're starting to see, after yesterday's euphoria about the JOLTS report, kind of we're in this yo-yo economy, to where today the data was weaker. That brought in the belief that the Fed may cut rates. And I think from the fixed income perspective, because I think a lot of people are nervous about yields, to me, it still shows that the long end of the curve will hedge against the potential for economic contraction, which I think the word recession might start coming up a bit more if we have more data like today.
You talk about the nervousness of a lot of people here, and I wonder how you're seeing through all of that, how you're sort of positioning amidst the uncertainty about trade policy, the prospects of maybe there being a recession, as you indicated, that could sort of come into play a little bit more. Are there clients who are nervous and panicking? And sort of what's the counsel that you're giving folks right now?
I think the big antidote for uncertainty is called diversification. And so I think a lot of people want to run and hide in cash and do whatever else. But to me, that always means that you think you know exactly what's going to happen, because that wins only in a few circumstances. And so I think diversification has been the big thing we continue to preach. And that's where I think a lot of people over the past few years have called it diversification, because they've only wanted to own U.S. large cap stocks, which have benefited from the past couple of years. And that's where most people want to only own those. I think there is different leadership going forward. This is a macroeconomic trend change. I think the administration wants a cheaper dollar. I think from a purchasing power parity perspective, the dollar needs to be cheaper. This is where there's going to be repatriation of cash possibly. And that's where I want people to branch out beyond just large cap stocks and look at places that have been underloved and underinvested in, like international stocks. I think about small and mid cap stocks, which are obviously domestic. They've been under the gun a bit the last couple of years because you have had a really narrow economy, pretty much just driven by AI stocks and AI companies. And that's where I think whatever happens on the opposite side of this, whether it's a recession or not, you will see the economy broaden back out. And that's where the message, I think, is the same as it always has been, which is essentially to diversify and to make sure that you're tilting towards those things that I just mentioned, which I think offer value for longer term investors.
I know that you had mentioned kind of the longer term, the long end of the Treasury curve. A lot of those bets have not really posted positive returns, over the last couple months. Just walk us through kind of the rationale for really extending out further out onto the curve when, you can pretty much collect a pretty decent yield if you just stay in the 2-year or even a money market fund.
Yeah, if you stay in the 2-year money market fund, what happens if today is 2008, 2009, and the yields on the 2-year are higher than the 10-year, but for the next 15, 20 years, the 10-year, basically yields sub 2, and you have to reinvest that 2-year multiple times because it goes to zero. And so that's where I think at a minimum you should invest across the curve. The thesis is back to diversification, and you look at today's action. I use the R word. And I use the word contraction, and people are now thinking about that just a bit. And you can see on days like today, it does hedge downside risk that would occur if and when we actually do have a recession. And so I do think longer term, higher yields or more normal yields are here to stay. And I think you could possibly see higher inflation as a result of the deglobalization, the desire to actually maybe inflate away a little bit of our debts. But in the here and now, I think despite all the noise that's out there, days like today, days like we've had over the past few years, where you see fears of recession grow, I think it still shows that people will run to U.S. Treasuries. And that's how I think about hedging a portfolio against adverse outcomes. I think the one area that people don't have exposure to that they should, because for the last 15, 20 years, the way that you hedged a portfolio was only through long Treasuries, because you really only had one side of the distribution. That was essentially deflation. I think your question probably ties into the other side of the distribution, which now is probably just as likely, which is higher inflation. And that's where we, from a diversification standpoint, still think people should own real assets like commodities as a hedge against a different outcome. Both of those are kind of the outside outliers in the tails. We want to maintain investments, but we want to make sure that we own things that can actually hedge us through downturns.
Brian, I want you to be perspective in the time we have left here. So let's look ahead to Friday. We're going to get this jobs report. Do you see it as just another element of hard data here? Does it take on kind of increased importance in light of what we saw today from the ADP? Is it more important than we saw last month? Or what are you looking for when the Labor Department releases those data on Friday?
I think it's incredibly important because I think you've had a market rally on the belief that we're at max tariff uncertainty, which I'm not for sure that we're at. And I don't think this is just a negotiation. I do believe that if you parse the words of the administration, they want the revenue and they believe in tariffs and they're not going away. The second part is that hard data into soft data, or soft data into hard data. I think last week we saw jobless claims spike just a bit. We saw continuing claims rise. We had ADP today. And so I think Friday's jobs report, Friday's labor market report is incredibly important. I think the oddity is that right now people believe that even if the labor market were to weaken, or even if the data were to weaken, think about days like today when, as Emily mentioned, Fed bets go up. The market believes that it's a buying opportunity either way, and that the Fed can actually cushion the blow. I'm not for sure, at least historically, that the Fed can absolutely cushion the blow. And so to me, that's where I do think the jobs market and the data on Friday will be incredibly important. If it's good, it's probably coast all clear for a while. If it's bad, then we'll see what actually happens. I suppose the reaction will be different than what it is today, because ADP is kind of thought of as maybe a secondary type of employment index. But we'll see on Friday.
Just very quickly before we let you go, 20 seconds here. It's interesting then to see kind of these more speculative areas of the market rallying. You look at the NASDAQ 100 is higher. A basket of the most shorted stocks from Goldman Sachs is higher today. And yet you're seeing that this economic data is weaker. Just in 30 seconds, help us understand the difference there between what's going on and animal spirits.
I think there's an insatiable demand from individual investors to buy things that have worked in the past. And that's been the formula for a while. And that's where you've seen most of the buying over the past few months has been through individual investors, not institutional. And we'll see if they continue to follow along those lines. That's where momentum buying has worked. And that's what I'd be cautious of going forward, because I do believe that if you did have a downturn, some of those speculative areas might get hit quite a bit.
Brent Schutte, thank you so much. It's always great to talk to you. He's the Chief Investment Officer of Northwestern Mutual Wealth Management.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Businessweek Daily podcast. Catch us live weekday afternoons from 2 to 5 p.m. Eastern. Listen on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. Or watch us live on YouTube.
One of the most read stories on the terminal today is the Bloomberg Big Take, a harrowing account of a fatal 2023 car crash involving a Tesla Model Y that was using full self-driving, a crash that took place in Arizona on Interstate 17 between Flagstaff and Phoenix. Bloomberg News senior technology reporter and contributor to the Elon Inc. podcast, Dana Hull, writes that as Elon Musk touts robo-taxis in Austin, federal regulators are investigating whether the system in the Tesla is dangerous even with a human behind the wheel. Dana joins us now from the Bloomberg San Francisco Bureau, and I should commend this piece to everybody. It's sobering and includes very dramatic video captured by this car as it goes at highway speed and crashes into someone next to her Toyota RAV4. Dana, talk a bit about the video that you were able to obtain, that Bloomberg News was able to obtain here. It was through a public records request. But what it shows, what it reveals about what seems to be a huge flaw here in this feature that Elon Musk has touted.
Yeah, so thanks, David. To back up for a little bit, in October, NHTSA announced that it was investigating what Tesla calls FSD because of 4 crashes where the system seemed to struggle with fog, glare, dust storms, things like that. And they mentioned one of the crashes was a fatality involving a pedestrian. And I read the NHTSA report and was like, wait, what, a pedestrian was killed? Like, what was this? What happened? And there weren't any other details. So I filed a records request and got the crash report, over 250 photographs, and some pretty harrowing footage, some of which we shared with everyone today. And it just really shows this vehicle not slowing down despite the glare on the screen, and not seeing parked cars with their hazard lights on, not seeing another human being like desperately kind of signaling to them to slow down. And then hitting this woman, we stopped before the impact, but then obviously this woman is sort of hit straight on. And it just raises a lot of questions. And, Tesla fans will say that the software and the hardware since then has been upgraded, and I'm sure that it has. But at the time, the driver was using what was likely the most up-to-date version of that FSD that existed. And it's just a really tragic case that a lot of people don't know about.
So talk a little bit about full self-driving. And in the case of this crash, what we know about what the driver was doing, what drivers of Teslas with FSD are told. Are they supposed to keep their hands on the wheel? Do they have full control over the brakes and wheel? How does that work?
So that's been a big issue in terms of how Tesla has marketed this. It is marketed as FSD, but Tesla makes very clear in all of its literature to its owners that the owner of the car is responsible for the car at all times and should be ready to take over. So we don't really know. All we have is what the driver said in the crash report, which was, "I'm sorry, it all happened so fast. All of a sudden, there were cars in front of me, and I couldn't stop." So we don't know more than what he told police right in the aftermath of the crash. I do think it's significant that Tesla ultimately reported this crash to NHTSA, and the investigation that, NHTSA's investigation is ongoing.
Dana, you could step outside our bureau in San Francisco and you could hail a Waymo, a self-driving taxi. And I think it's useful to explain the difference in the way these self-driving systems work. So we're talking about a Tesla system here that relies predominantly, if not exclusively, on cameras. How does that differ from what Waymo is doing from its competitor?
Yeah, so if you live in a city like San Francisco or Austin, where Waymo is ubiquitous now, they have a lot of sensors. They use cameras, they use radar, they use LiDAR. LiDAR is the thing that kind of spins around on the top. A lot of people complain that it looks very clunky, but they have a very robust sensor suite so that the vehicle is not reliant on one input. They are kind of actively gathering data from around the car using multiple sensors. And that is one approach. That is the approach that Waymo has taken. It's the approach that, others like Aurora and Zoox have also taken. Elon Musk has taken a very different approach. And his idea is that a vision-based system or a camera-based system with a lot of machine learning and these incredible neural nets can basically do the same job for much cheaper. And part of the argument is that Tesla has so many cars on the road that they have a lot of data that they have trained their systems on. And so, there's a big debate in autonomous vehicle development about whether you can truly be self-driving without LiDAR or not. I just think what this crash shows is that a camera-based system struggles sometimes with glare, and this was one of those very tragic edge cases.
What have the regulators said, if anything, about these systems that just use cameras?
I mean, they have not, they are investigating 4 crashes where they seem to struggle in these certain conditions like glare, but they have not they're not ordering a recall or anything like that. And just note that investigations do take quite a lot of time. There's typically a lot of back and forth between NHTSA and automakers. They ask for a lot of engineering details, and they often do take several months.
I'm curious here sort of about the way that this administration and the Department of Transportation in particular see the advent of and the adoption of self-driving vehicles like the one that's featured in this story. Do they see it as the future? Do they see it as kind of a complement to the way that we drive today? Sort of how are they looking at the prospect of these cars being on the road?
I think they very much see it as the future. And, we have to remind everyone that roughly 40,000 people die in traffic accidents in the United States every year. A lot of traffics are because of speeding, because of drug and alcohol use. And if there is anything that we could do to really drive that number down, that would be terrific. And that has always been the promise of autonomous vehicles, that autonomous vehicles can drive when you're tired, and they can do long-haul freight runs, that kind of thing. But as we're seeing these vehicles, being deployed either in testing situations or, starting to become commercialized, there have been accidents. And I think that the industry needs to be very upfront about what those accidents have been.
We only have about a minute left, but I'm wondering if you could compare, where Tesla currently is in this race for autonomous driving versus other U.S. automakers.
I think the big competitor to Tesla is Waymo. As David mentioned, I can, step outside of my San Francisco office and hail a Waymo, and it will show up, and there is not a driver there. Tesla does not yet have a functioning robotaxi, customer service-based system yet. They are talking about kind of launching one in Austin this month. We'll see whether that's a big event or like a soft launch. But, they are definitely, they don't have a commercial business doing a robotaxi yet. However, that's been the big promise of the company for quite some time now, that, we're going to see robotaxis everywhere. And eventually if you own a Tesla, will be able to add your vehicle to this growing fleet.
Dana, thank you very much, and thanks for the reporting as well. The piece is A Fatal Tesla Crash Shows the Limits of Full Self-Driving by Dana Hull. She wrote it with Craig Trudell and features, again, this very sobering video. We didn't show any of it to our audience on television and YouTube, but you can see up until the moment that self-driving Tesla hits a pedestrian in Arizona just a couple of years back, and it's well worth reading just to hear about the limitations of that software, of that feature in the Tesla. You can read the full story and more from the Bloomberg Big Take on the Bloomberg Terminal and at Bloomberg.com/Big Take. Again, that piece there by Dana Hull with Craig Trudell.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Businessweek Daily Podcast. Catch us live weekday afternoons from 2 to 5 Eastern. Listen on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. Or watch us live on YouTube.
David Gura here with Emily Grafeo in for Tim Stenivek and Carol Massar. They're off today. It was a good time to be in the mortgage business back in 2020. That is when Dan Gilbert, billionaire Dan Gilbert, took his Quicken Loans, now Rocket Companies, public. As Brad Stone, the editor of Bloomberg Businessweek, writes, Americans enjoying cheap money and still warm stimulus checks were happily refinancing at a rapid clip, and Dan Gilbert was then one of the richest people on earth. Of course, mortgage rates have gone up since then, and Rocket Company's annual revenue is expected to go down. Its share price down almost 30% since that company went public. Good occasion for Brad Stone to check in with Dan Gilbert to see how he's doing, how the company's doing. We'll talk about both of those things with him. Now, Brad joins us from our bureau in San Francisco. Brad, we're going to talk about Dan Gilbert, the person here, in just a moment, but let's start with the company and the challenges it faces. How different is this company from what it was back in 2020?
Maybe not that different. They are in a cyclical industry. They have seen rates go up and rates go down. Dan is someone who, runs not just a company, but a little bit of a corporate cult. He doesn't like to lay people off. But as a result, the company has lost about 30% of its market cap since rates started creeping up after the pandemic. And they're getting a little bit of outside pressure. For the first time, there's an activist investor in the stock. And he's really rethinking, well, what is Rocket? And so recently they made two kind of rapid fire acquisitions. One is a brand that most people probably know, Redfin, the home listing company. And then another one's called Mr. Cooper, a Dallas company that does underwriting that they have announced an intent to acquire for about $9 billion. Both of those deals have yet to close, but the idea that Dan relays to me is like, let's not just see our customer once every 7-10 years when they're ready to take out a new mortgage or refinance, but maybe have a relationship with them through the entire lifespan of a mortgage.
I found it interesting that you write that Gilbert, who owns about 70% of Rocket, is responding to a lot of the uncertainty with the most significant changes to his company since 1998. So talk a little bit more. I know you mentioned the acquisitions, but just about what makes the changes that he's undergoing just so significant.
Yeah, I mean, it's really the acquisition. Well, first of all, he's hired a new CEO, Varun Krishna, a former PayPal guy. He ran the TurboTax business at Intuit. Dan hasn't been the CEO for quite some time, but we all know a little bit about founder-led companies. And Dan has really brought in a kind of Silicon Valley guy to sort of run the company and to steer Rocket through the AI revolution. Now, underwriting a loan, servicing a loan, it's an enormously, employee, human-intensive business. And so AI is offering a lot of opportunities for Rocket to get slimmer. So I think the changes are twofold. One, making these two acquisitions and saying Rocket is not just going to be your refi company, but it's going to hold the customer's hand through the entire home buying process. They want to get into the real estate business, essentially, with Redfin. And then it's this mindset of what can we do with AI to make the process more efficient. And that will be very interesting because, as I said, Dan sees his employees as sort of an extended family. And so the question that Value Act and some of these other shareholders, and Value Act as the activist shareholder, they probably want to see steeper cuts. And so I think there's a little bit of tension and suspense building around how Dan will be navigating the next few years.
Brad, pardon. Please excuse the obligatory question about artificial intelligence, but I have to ask it. What does Dan Gilbert think the role of artificial intelligence is going to be here in the mortgage and mortgage servicing industry?
Yeah, and maybe this kind of comes through in the piece, which is I think he's putting a little bit of a happy face on it. He thinks that it can aid the customer in the paperwork of filling out a loan. It can be a help to the company in servicing customer service calls. And yet he doesn't necessarily project like great displacement in his workforce. I don't know about that. I mean, it does seem like, these models are now quite good enough that maybe you could start to replace some of the human labor behind the underwriting process. So, I think the overarching answer is it makes the process more efficient. It simplifies this labyrinth of county by county, state by state paperwork. Rocket is a big company because it's been able to do that. But then the question is, how much does it automate? How much does it mean that Rocket doesn't need its thousands of employees anymore?
Brad, you had the opportunity to actually sit down with the billionaire businessman. How is he staying positive amid all of these changes in his company, amid health issues that he's experienced?
Right. And I think, that is, and Emily and David, you're going to appreciate this. I'll give you a little bit of background. I'm a Cleveland guy, okay? And so Dan Gilbert, he owns the Cavs. He has always loomed very large in the civic life of not just Cleveland, but Detroit, where he's based. I've always wanted to meet him. And in particular, his story's gotten very interesting because he's one of the richest people in the world. But in 2019, he suffered a debilitating stroke. And really, over the past 6 years, he's been just battling back. He lost the entire use of the left side of his body. He really can't walk. He's only now beginning to stand and take a few steps unaided without a cane. And so I think, Emily, the way you phrase the question is a good one. He does remain positive. He doesn't have control over some central things in his life, not only his own physical health, but interest rates, which has a major impact on his business. He is almost single-handedly reviving downtown Detroit by buying and rehabbing buildings. So I think it's just a point of view, despite these massive challenges, despite things that are out of his control, he has an entrepreneurial mindset, and he's kind of continued to battle. And, he has amazing resources. And so it's not just the rehab, but stem cell treatments and testosterone shots. And he's doing everything he can. I think he's really defied the odds, not just in business, but also in his personal life.
Just a wonderful photograph of him made by a photographer. At the end of that piece, you can see him standing up. So despite those difficulties, making the effort to stand up for a photograph there at the end, keeping in mind all that you were talking about. You mentioned his role in Cleveland, his role in Detroit. Talk a bit, if you would, about his aspirations and kind of the civic life of both of those places. We were talking about sports here a moment ago, but he has made a name for himself as someone who's very philanthropically minded, Brad.
Right. Look, you go 10 years ago, you go to downtown Detroit, and, it looks like something out of a 70s dystopian science fiction movie. It was just the central core was totally abandoned. Cleveland, a city I'm more familiar with, pretty similar, lots of sort of development starts and stops. And look, we're very familiar with the tech CEOs who have used their wealth to get to space, to solve global disease on the other side of the world. Dan just decided that he's going to have an impact closer to home. And in downtown Detroit, alongside the Central Woodward Avenue, he's been buying properties. He's building a skyscraper where GM is going to move its headquarters when it's completed. He moved Rocket from a suburb downtown, I think 20 years ago. And the idea is to really rehabilitate these industrial Midwest cities with glorious architecture and amazing flourishes in the buildings. He's taken a building, I think it's called the Library Building in downtown Detroit, completely rehabbed it. There's a hotel there. All the original touches were there, and he's brought life back to these abandoned city cores. And so that is his mission, as well as addressing the disease that took the life of one of his children. He's donated a lot of money to that. So it's really philanthropy around things close to him that is important to him, and that's where he wants to leave a legacy.
And for those just tuning in, we're speaking with Bloomberg Businessweek editor Brad Stone on his feature story about Dan Gilbert. Brad, I want to finish off by going to the headline of your story, that Cavs owner Gilbert wants to donate his billions. You write that he told you he wants to pretty much donate all of his wealth before he passes away. It seems like we're hearing more billionaires do that. Like there's the billionaires that go into space, but then there's also these businessmen that have these major pledges, right?
Right. I mean, he has signed the Giving Pledge, and that I think that you guys could check me on this, but I think the goal there is to give away half your wealth in your during your life, right? But Bill Gates recently said his intention is to spend down the his fortune, and Dan Gilbert's very much the same. He told me that he is having more fun giving the money away than he was accumulating it. He's got these causes: the health of downtown Detroit, downtown Cleveland, solving not just the disease that took the life of his son, but addressing the challenges faced by stroke victims. And he wants to leave an impact. And so he's still very much focused on Rocket. He's there 2 days a week, but he's also totally invested in these other causes and wants to see the impact of his philanthropy during the course of his life.
Brad, great to talk to you. It's a great piece as well. Brad Stone interviewing Dan Gilbert, of course, the founder of Rocket Companies, formerly Quicken Loans. A really strong profile looking at him and the personal struggles he's facing on right now, and struggles at the company as well, amidst this environment where interest rates are higher than they were back when it went public. But commend that to everybody. You can read Brad's story on the Bloomberg and at Bloomberg.com/Businessweek. Brad Stone, the editor of Businessweek magazine. And Emily, I was just struck. He details so well the way that Dan Gilbert has faced these personal challenges himself. And again, I did go back to that photograph, but clearly must have been a very poignant moment when, having taken a number of photographs sitting down, he stood up for a couple shots standing up, as well as he tries to get his ability to walk once again. And Brad alluding to the fact that this is a company now that's facing a bit of activist pressure, talking about Value Act, taking a 9.9% stake in this company. And I think a lot of that has to do with this issue of AI and the degree to which this company embraces it and begins to kind of use it in the mortgage business. It'll be fascinating to watch that going forward.
And let's not forget that he's also the owner of an NBA team.
The Cavaliers.
And Brad Stone pointed out that Gilbert actually persuaded LeBron James to return to the Cavs after he had departed for the Miami Heat. Of course, now LeBron James not in Cleveland, but I'm sure Brad Stone, as a Cleveland guy, a Midwest guy, was happy about that.
Few good seasons and a championship while he was there. No small thing.
This is the Bloomberg Businessweek Daily Podcast. Available on Apple, Spotify, and anywhere else you get your podcasts. Listen live weekday afternoons from 2 to 5 p.m. Eastern on Bloomberg.com, the iHeartRadio app, TuneIn, and the Bloomberg Business app. You can also watch us live every weekday on YouTube and always on the Bloomberg Terminal.